welcome back to Boring Bedtime. Tonight, we drift into the final chapter of the man known as the Sword of God, in the endless wind of the Syrian desert. 6 days of battle had turned the earth to dust and silence. The greatest army of Byzantium had marched to end a faith and, instead, vanished into history. Tonight, we return to that final dawn, where Khalid Ibn al-Walid, the Sword of Allah, faced not only his enemies, but the quiet test of his own soul. Close your eyes. Let the echoes of the battlefield fade into the calm. This is the final whirlwind, the last chapter of the Sword of Allah. Day 3, Attrition and Endurance. Day 3 was characterized by a grinding war of attrition under the harshest conditions imaginable. Vahan, realizing the futility of breaking the disciplined Muslim right flank, shifted his focus entirely to the left flank, commanded by Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah. The attack here was supported by the terrifying iron chain itself, which slowly pivoted to apply pressure. The chained men, impervious to retreat, marched forward, their spears lowered, pushing Abu Ubaidah's command steadily backward towards the gorge of the Yarmouk. Abu Ubaidah, the pious diplomat, showed the steel of the true commander. He walked among his men, not with the fire of Khalid, but with the quiet, unyielding conviction of a man who believed absolutely in the righteousness of their cause. "Be patient, O my brothers," he urged, as the roar of the Byzantine army echoed across the canyon. "Their steel is heavy, their hearts are divided. Our faith is our armor. We fight for God, and death is merely the door to the victory we seek." The fighting devolved into brutal, close-quarters combat. The Byzantines relied on their long spears and heavy shields. The Arabs used their speed, agile swords, and quick reflexes to duck under the spears and stab at the vulnerable legs and faces of the heavy infantry. Many of the Muslim archers focused on the eyes and joints of the Byzantine horses and the faces of the enemy soldiers, trying to break the psychological wall of the iron chain. Khalid, maintaining his central position, committed the Talia again, using them not as attackers but as firefighters, transferring them rapidly to reinforce any Kurds that threatened to break beneath the Byzantine pressure. The fatigue on both sides was overwhelming. The heat and the relentless rhythm of attack and counterattack wore down the armored Byzantine soldiers fastest. Their lack of water and their slow resupply chain were beginning to take their toll. By the end of the 3rd day, the Byzantines had lost far more men than the Muslims, though the Muslim losses were irreplaceable. Khalid's army had survived the initial shattering shock, and had proven that sheer numbers and heavy armor were not enough to guarantee victory. They had successfully contained the immense enemy force, holding their line at an almost unbelievable cost. The field of Yarmouk had become a crucible of fire and desperation, but the fragile, brilliant tactical structure devised by Khalid, supported by the iron will of the women at the rear, remained intact. The stalemate was set, but attrition was now tilting the balance subtly towards the lighter, more enduring forces of the Caliphate. The time for defense was nearly over. The moment for the decisive stroke was fast approaching. The final whirlwind, the decisive victory day for the Day of the Eyes, August 18th, 636 CE. The 4th day of the Battle of Yarmouk began not with the thunder of hooves or the clash of shields, but with the terrifying whisper of 10,000 arrows. General Vahan, the astute Byzantine commander, realized that 3 days of heavy infantry attacks against the flexible Arab lines had only exhausted his own forces. He shifted tactics dramatically, seeking to use the one advantage his large professional army had, a massive, highly skilled archer corps. The day became known in Arab accounts as Yom Alain, the Day of the Eyes. Vahan ordered his concentrated archers to unleash a devastating, coordinated volley targeting the lightly armored Muslim foot soldiers and, crucially, the faces and eyes of the entire front rank. The result was horrific. The Muslim lines, unaccustomed to such overwhelming long-range bombardment, suffered devastating casualties, losing hundreds of men and, tragically, blinding an estimated 700 to 1,000 Muslim soldiers in a single morning. The losses were so severe that the Muslim lines began to waver, and the cries of the wounded and blinded threatened to break the morale of the entire army. Even Khalid's tactical genius could not protect men from the skies. Once more, it was the raw spiritual discipline of the Arabs, enforced by the women's corps, that prevented total rout. The blinded men, led by those who could still see, refused to abandon their positions, often shouting, "Paradise is now assured," to rally their comrades. Their stoic defiance stabilized the center. Khalid, however, knew he could not sustain this level of attrition. The moment for defense was over. The time for the Sayfla, Day 5. The night of decision Day 5 was a tense, deceptive lull. Vahan, shaken by the heavy losses his own side had suffered in the previous counterattacks, and seeing the horrific casualties inflicted on the Arabs by the archers, sought a final, desperate negotiation. He sent an emissary to the Muslim camp, offering a truce and a withdrawal if the Arabs would simply leave Syria with a vast indemnity of gold. Khalid met the Byzantine envoys. He saw the desperation behind the offer. The Byzantines were tired, starving, and now profoundly demoralized by the sheer, unyielding fanaticism of the Arabs. He knew that the massive Byzantine machine, fighting far from its supply lines, was now weaker than his own forces, despite the disparity in numbers. He refused the offer instantly. The time for diplomacy was past. Khalid spent the entirety of the night in council with his commanders. The plan he laid out was audacious and terrifying, relying on a level of synchronized, rapid movement that only his mobile guard Talia could execute. The plan, pin the center. The Muslim infantry, the Kurds, would launch an all-out frontal assault on the massive Byzantine center, the iron chain, not to break it, but to fix it in place and prevent Vahan from maneuvering his reserves. The flank attack, Khalid would personally lead his mobile guard around the Byzantine left flank, the weakest and most exposed portion of the enemy line, which lay dangerously close to the deep gorge of the Yarmouk River. The double envelopment. The cavalry would strike the Byzantine rear, then execute a sharp inner turn, trapping the entire left wing of the Byzantine army between the Muslim cavalry and the impassable Yarmouk gorge. The flank would be cut off, unable to retreat or receive aid. By dawn, every soldier knew the plan. Their only path to safety lay in the success of the charge. Day 6, the final whirlwind, August 20th, 636 CE. The sixth and final day of the battle opened with an unprecedented frenzy of violence. As the sun rose, the entire Muslim line surged forward, not in a defensive posture, but in a desperate, screaming assault against the Byzantine center. The disciplined Muslim infantry achieved their goal. The Byzantines, faced with the ferocity of the charge, were locked into a brutal, grinding melee, unable to look to their flanks. While the center was thus engaged, Khalid launched the mobile guard, 4,000 horsemen, hardened veterans, moved like a singular, unstoppable whirlwind. They rode hard against the outer edge of the Byzantine left flank, which was composed of a mix of Armenian heavy cavalry and loyalist Arab auxiliaries. The speed of the Thalia was too great, and the surprise absolutely the flank collapses. The Armenian cavalry, finding themselves outflanked and cut off from their own center, collapsed. Khalid's cavalry punched through the collapsing wing and wheeled inward, striking the Byzantine center's exposed rear flank. This was the stroke that decided the campaign. The Byzantine army was now facing its worst nightmare, a total flank collapse, while its primary strength, the iron chain in the center, was pinned and unable to move laterally due to the chains and the pressure from the Muslim infantry. The fatal pivot, Khalid's inner maneuver, sealed the fate of the Byzantine left wing. The thousands of men in that wing found themselves pressed inward toward the center, but with their line of retreat completely cut off by the Muslim cavalry. They had been successfully boxed in against the sheer cliff face of the Yarmouk Gorge panic. The great enemy of disciplined armies finally overcame the Byzantines. For 5 days, the iron chain had prevented retreat. Now, the chains became a mousetrap. The catastrophe of the ravine with the left flank dissolving and the iron chain now surrounded on 3 sides and unable to maneuver. General Vahan's command structure disintegrated. The heavy, exhausted, and bewildered Roman soldiers found their retreat blocked by the mobile guard in front of them and the impassable ravines behind them. The collapse became a rout, and the rout became a catastrophic slaughter. The Byzantine soldiers, shackled together, could not flee the battlefield. As one man stumbled on the treacherous, rocky ground, 10 others were pulled down with him. Hundreds, then thousands of men, in a terrifying, confused panic, were forced over the sheer drop of the Yarmouk Gorge and into the rocky riverbed below. The sheer weight of the bodies of the chained men piled on top of each other created a grim dam in the ravine. Many of the Byzantines who did not fall to the sword were crushed by their own comrades or died of thirst in the gorge. Vahan and his remaining command attempted a desperate, final counterattack in the center, but their purpose was gone. Vahan himself was reportedly killed in the ensuing confusion. By sundown on the 6th day, the field of Yarmouk was covered in the wreckage of the Byzantine army. The vast imperial host of Heraclius was utterly destroyed. Only a small fraction of the army managed to escape north toward Antioch and Edessa. The loss of life was staggering, and the strategic consequences were irreversible. The Muslim army, battered but victorious, stood victorious on the field. They had suffered grievous losses, but they had won the world. Khalid Ibn al-Walid, the controversial general, had achieved his masterpiece. By combining tactical patience, the defensive stand of days 1, 2, 3, with absolute offensive ruthlessness, the flanking maneuver of day 6, he proved that a small, disciplined, and highly motivated force, led by genius, could overcome the greatest conventional military power on earth. The conquest of the Levant was now secured. Heraclius would never again raise an army large enough to challenge the caliphate in Syria. The legacy of the unsheathed sword, Heraclius's farewell, the news of the total destruction of the grand army at the Yarmouk Gorge, reached Emperor Heraclius in Antioch, not as a report, but as a final, crushing reality. The scale of the defeat, the loss of perhaps 70,000 to 100,000 professional soldiers, was a catastrophe the Byzantine Empire could not overcome. The Levant, the rich, vital province that bridged Anatolia and Egypt, was irrevocably lost. Heraclius, the man who had resurrected the empire after the Persian Wars, now faced the bitterest moment of his life. He gathered his court and began the slow, painful withdrawal, taking with him the holy relics and what treasure could be salvaged. As he crossed the Taurus Mountains, the traditional border between Syria and Anatolia, he paused at a high point overlooking the plains he had lost forever. With a heavy heart, Heraclius spoke the words that marked the end of Roman dominion in the Levant, a lament recorded by history. Peace be with thee, O Syria, and what an excellent country this is for the enemy. No traveler shall return hither except in fear. With that mournful farewell, the emperor retreated into the security of Constantinople. The military conquest of Syria was complete. The Muslim armies under Khalid were free to establish their control, securing Jerusalem, Caesarea, and the remaining cities. The caliphate now stretched from the Arabian Peninsula to the foot of the Taurus Mountains. The messenger and the new caliph. It was immediately after the victory at Yarmouk, while the Muslim soldiers were still counting the spoils and tending to their wounded, that a messenger arrived from Medina bearing two pieces of news, one glorious and one sobering. The glorious news was the announcement of the victory itself, which sent a wave of ecstatic celebration throughout the small, victorious army. The sobering news was the revelation that Caliph Abu Bakr had died shortly after the victory order was dispatched. The new Caliph of the Muslims was Umar ibn al-Khattab. The change in leadership was profound, particularly for Khalid ibn al-Walid. Abu Bakr, the gentle pragmatist, had been his unwavering shield, tolerating Khalid's controversial methods because of his unparalleled military necessity. Umar, the man of uncompromising justice and ascetic piety, was Khalid's greatest, most principled critic. Umar's first act, as Caliph executed even before the news of Yarmouk reached him, was to dispatch a clear, unyielding order to the victorious army. Khalid ibn al-Walid was immediately relieved of his command, and Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah was restored as the sole commander-in-chief of the Syrian armies. The sheathing of the sword, the letter containing the order, arrived on the field of his greatest triumph. Khalid had just finished dictating his report of the annihilation of the Byzantine host, the masterpiece of his career. Abu Ubaidah, tasked with delivering the news, was hesitant, dreading the reaction of the great, victorious general. He knew that any other man, having just won the world for his people against impossible odds, would have been consumed by pride and rebellion. The army adored Khalid. They would have followed him anywhere. Abu Ubaidah approached Khalid quietly and handed him the decree. Khalid read the words of the new caliph. The text was direct, citing the need to ensure that the army knew their victories came from God alone, not from any single man, however brilliant. It was an act of profound theological and political correction. Khalid paused, his expression unreadable. He had led this army through fire and sand to secure the entire province. Now, at the peak of his glory, he was being stripped of his authority by a man who had long distrusted his character. The moment was a crucible. It was the ultimate test of the man who bore the title of the Sword of God. Would he use that sword against his own caliph, or would he submit to the principle of the state? Khalid chose submission. He stood before his assembled officers and announced the change of command. He did not rant, he did not protest, and he did not incite his loyal men to refuse the order. He simply and publicly placed his authority under the rule of Caliph Umar and the leadership of Abu Ubaidah. His famous, humble statement on his removal would forever define his character and obey. If they had taken command from me when I was struggling in Persia, I might have protested. But now that God has granted us victory, I care not who is the commander. My loyalty is to the caliphate, not to my rank. The enduring legacy. Khalid Ibn al-Walid remained in Syria, not as a commander, but as a loyal soldier under Abu Ubaidah. He continued to fight, advise, and lead troops from the front line, proving that his dedication was indeed to the mission and not the position. He helped secure the final coastal cities, including the decisive capture of Caesarea. He was later called back to Medina and, in a final act of accountability, was stripped of some of the wealth he had amassed during the campaigns of final correction by Caliph Umar to ensure financial probity. Khalid accepted this, too, in silence. Khalid Ibn al-Walid died quietly of natural causes in Homs, Syria, in 642 CE, only 6 years after his greatest triumph. He was not killed in battle, as he had always wished. On his deathbed, he reportedly showed his old battle wounds to his friends, scores of scars covering his body, and lamented that he would die in bed like an old camel, rather than on the battlefield like a warrior. His legacy is twofold. First, he was the greatest military mind of the early caliphate, the architect of the irreversible conquest of the Levant. He fought dozens of battles and tactical engagements and was never once defeated. Second, and far more profound, his quiet submission to the political and moral authority of Caliph Umar, even at the peak of his fame, established a critical precedent that in the Islamic State, no individual, not even the legendary Sword of God, stood above the law or the authority of the Caliph. His life concluded, and so, with a great crash of bodies into the unseen ravine, the most decisive victory in the early history of the Caliphate was won. The vast Roman dominion over the Levant, a hold that had lasted for centuries, was lost in a single day, sealed by the genius of Khalid Ibn al-Walid. But the real ending to our story is not on the battlefield, but in a small tent. Moments after the triumph, a letter arrives from Medina. It contains the news of a new caliph and an immediate, unyielding decree. Khalid is stripped of his command. Imagine that moment. The world won, the cheers of the army still ringing in the air, and a lifetime of authority suddenly withdrawn. Any other man might have raged, rebelled, or seized power. But Khalid, the uncompromising warrior, made his final, quiet choice. He placed his loyalty not with his own fame, but with the principle of the state. He stepped down, a loyal soldier once more, setting a precedent that was, in its own way, a greater victory than Yarmouk. The sword of God proved that even the greatest genius must yield to justice. He spent his final years not as a glorious commander, but as a loyal veteran, dying quietly in bed. Far from the battlefield he sought. He did not achieve the death he desired, but he left behind a legacy that transcended combat, a nation built on obedience to a higher law. Khalid had conquered empires, yet in the end he chose obedience over glory, silence over fame. The man who never lost a battle, surrendered only to humility. And so, as the desert winds carry away the echoes of his victories, we drift beyond history, beyond noise, into the quiet truth that even the mightiest must rest. You've been listening to Boring Bedtime. Drift into calm.